Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Introduction to Critical Theory, lecture on structuralism, week 4. A little delayed, but we're here at the end. So, structuralism. To begin with, I assigned you all to read Peter Barry, his chapter, as usual, in Beginning Theory on this particular topic, and I think it's a good place to start with this lecture. So I just got a nice summary out of Barry here that I'm going to read out as a very basic, very simple, very user-friendly, reader-friendly overview of what the quite complex discipline of structuralism can be summarised as. So here's Barry. Structuralism is an intellectual movement which began in France in the 1950s and is first seen in the work of the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1908 to 2009, and the literary critic Roland Barthes, 1915 to 1980. These are names we're going to return to. It is difficult to boil structuralism down to a single bottom-line proposition, but if forced to do so, I would say that its essence is the belief that things cannot be understood in isolation. They have to be seen in the context of the larger structures they are part of, hence the term structuralism. Structuralism was important into Britain mainly in the 1970s and attained widespread influence and even notoriety throughout the 1980s. So nice, concise, well expressed, very clear, but some interesting stuff there being flagged up. Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes, two very important names that we're going to return to, and you get this idea of structuralism being something which is imported into certain disciplines. Lévi-Strauss is an anthropologist, Barthes is a literary critic, but this isn't where structuralism began. It began earlier than this, as we'll see shortly, but it had quite a wide afterlife. There's a mention there of its kind of French origins, and then it being imported into Britain a bit later on, as with these sort of faddish continental literary movements. In Britain, we tend to get them a bit later than the French. We get them, they kind of have their French heyday in the 50s, for example, and then we get them 20 years later in the 70s, when they're already become passé in French. So that tends to be, we see that with post-structuralism as well, which we'll look at in a coming lecture. But for now, this is a good starting point. What's important here, perhaps, Barry does flag up the idea of structure, as in structuralism, that it's essentially having to look at things in groupings, in collectives, rather than individually. And this sets quite a distinct opposition to the topic of liberal humanism, which we looked at in week 2, if you recall, the kind of the new criticism, the practical criticism, I.A. Richards, W.K. Wimsatt, the intentional fallacy, all that stuff we looked at in week 2, which I'm sure you'll remember well, which is kind of the English, American approach, which contrasts very distinctively with this sort of French-styled structuralist approach. In liberal humanism, it's about close reading, isn't it? About having a poem, for example, on the table in front of you and looking at that in pure isolation, looking at that alone, trying to get to the bottom of that, to the bottom of its complex system of ironies and ambiguities and intertextual references and whatever else. Whereas with structuralism, it's essentially the opposite of that. You're not looking at individual things, you're looking at individual things solely as aspects of one giant overarching structure. So it couldn't be more opposite, really, could it? So I've got here, this is the second bullet point, classical criticism, week 1, liberal humanism, week 2, so this kind of close reading stuff. And if we're looking at a sort of general timeline of the academies, a very simplistic one, liberal humanism did tend to get supplanted by structuralism from kind of the 1950s onward. This was kind of the new trendy imported discipline from France, which is very chic and overwhelmed and did away with the old-fashioned new critics and their kind of fetishization of the text. Structuralism itself, of course, gave way to post-structuralism, which we'll look at in a coming week. So there is a sort of linearity here, a chronology we can kind of roughly follow. It's something we'll come back to. So the big name here with structuralism is Ferdinand de Saussure. I mentioned earlier how structuralism began in a different genre, if you like, in a different field to the ones it ended up being imported into. Saussure we'll look at Saussure in depth in a second, but it's sufficient to say at this point that in the 1910s he kind of pioneered a lot of ideas. But then with the disruption of two world wars, with kind of the breakdown in communication between Europe and America, structuralism doesn't take off until the 1950s, a full 40 years later, when the ideas that Saussure has pioneered are taken and utilised in adjacent disciplines. So this is Levi Strauss and his anthropology, Barthes and his literary criticism. So there's quite a jump there between the two. Now this is a quote from a book which I've put a picture of here because I recommend it very highly as an introductory primer. This is Terence Hawke's Structuralism and Semiotics. And this is a lovely summarising paragraph that indicates the various facets that unify what we might call structuralism. If we look for a commonality between all of these different thinkers, so we're going to look at over the course of this lecture, this class, this is a nice way of unifying them. This is a nice way of saying what elements they have in common. So I'll just read this. But as I said, do look at this book in the library if you want to go a bit further with structuralism. It's very much written for the common readership. It's very simple, very short. It's kind of an introductory guide, so I recommend it highly. Anyway, here's the section. The true nature of things may be said to lie not in things themselves, but in the relationships which we construct. So this is the structuralist worldview. And then perceive between them. Okay, between is the important word there. This new concept, that the world is made up of relationships rather than things, constitutes the first principle of that way of thinking which can properly be called structuralist. At its simplest, it claims that the nature of every element in any given situation has no significance by itself, and in fact is determined by its relationship to all the other elements involved in that situation. In short, the full significance of any entity or experience cannot be perceived unless and until it is integrated into the structure of which it forms a part. So we're starting to get a good sense of the general meaning of this word structuralism now, aren't we? We're starting to see the central emphasis of that word structure to the concept that underpins all of these things. The idea that individual things aren't that important, only in the sense they're only important in the sense that they relate to an overarching connection with everything else. The world is not made up of items, it's not made up of things. All that matters is the relationship between these things, in the sense of a language, the connections you might have in a language. This applies to everything. We'll see more of this as the lecture goes along. So here we begin with de Saussure, 1857 to 1913. What's most important to know about Saussure is that he was a linguist. He worked in the field of linguistics, and as I'm sure all of you know, this is the field of the systematic study of language itself, how language works, how the different components of a language interact with each other, and the kind of the theoretical aspect of a language. I'm sure when all of you did English in some capacity at school, you covered linguistics briefly, so I won't labour the point about its definition, but suffice to say de Saussure was perhaps the most important linguist of the 20th century, not just in his own field, but in terms of the bleeding over influence he had on many other fields, again, as we'll see. His most famous book, his most important book, is The Course in General Linguistics, 1916. Interestingly, not a book he didn't even write. We're talking about the death of the author in the near future. This is perhaps a good example of that. After he died, you can see he died in 1913. This book was published in 1916. This was essentially his students who took his class, the course, a lecture series like this one. They took his course at the university, and out of their lecture notes, they composed a book together. So essentially it was made up of his opinions, his views, his theories, but it wasn't something he wrote. So that's the Course in General Linguistics. I'm going to try my best to summarise the important parts of this book. Well, not summarise all of it, because there's a great deal to it. I mean rather to summarise the parts of it that are directly useful to our field of study here today. It's important to note that Saussure delineated what he called the sign. I've got some helpful pictorial demonstrations of this shortly, but for now it's worth noting that it's what we might call a double entity. A sign is not just a thing itself, but it's constituted of two parts: signifiers, things which signify, which point towards, and signifieds, things which are signified, things which are pointed towards. A sign consists of these two elements. It's not a single entity, it's a double entity. Attached to this is the critical notion that signs themselves, or words as we might think of them, are arbitrary. That means that there is no essential or natural reason why a particular signifier should be attached to a particular signified. There's no inherent natural reason why there should be a connection between these two parts of the sign. Their connection is entirely arbitrary. There's no reason for it. It's not necessarily random, but there is no justice in it, if that makes sense. There's no real authoritative reason why we can say such a thing is connected to such a thing, why the word tree is connected to the concept of a tree. There's nothing tree-y about the word tree when you think about it. So the point I'm trying to lay here is that arbitrariness is the crucial word when it comes to Saussure and his theory of linguistics. Secondly, the idea that words, signs are relationary. This is an important concept for structuralism, and indeed for post-structuralism. This is that the idea that no word has any independent identity. It can't be defined independently, and its meaning only comes from its relationary definition to other concepts. If this sounds quite complex, I do have, as I've said, some graphs coming up that should hopefully make this a bit more straightforward and a bit easier. So just to summarise these two important points, these two halves of the sign. The signifier, that which signifies, is a symbol, a sound or an image, such as a word, that represents an underlying concept or meaning. It represents something, it stands for something, it points towards something. The signified is a concept or meaning as distinguished from the sign through which it is communicated. It is that which is pointed towards. It's that which is indicated. It is that which is signified. I hope that makes sense. Here's a nice picture. Excuse me. So you have the sign at the top there. This is the double entity. One half of it is the signifier, the physical existence, the sound, the word, the image. Here's some examples. Red leaf, round apple. And the signified is the concept, the thing which is pointed towards. So the fruit, the apple, freshness, healthy, temptation, etc., etc. So a bit more on arbitrariness. To reiterate, when we're talking about arbitrariness, we're talking about the relationship between the two aspects of the double entity sign, that being the signified and the signifier. There exists no natural appropriateness to the relationship between the sound image and the actual object it is associated with. Tree has no natural tree-like qualities, and there is no grander authority which justifies this association. We can see here a picture, figure 2, arbitrariness. Tree, word sound tree, actual tree. There's no reason why these two things should be associated. Accordingly, the system is self-contained and self-justifying. A language refers to no higher authority beyond itself. There is no absolute law that we have recourse to that indicates why the tree sound should be the tree symbol. It justifies itself within its own system. It is completely self-contained and self-justifying. It justifies itself. Tree sound means tree picture, means tree image, I should say, means tree concept, sorry, because the language says so. It is its own authority, and it has no higher recourse. So the arbitrariness of the change, of the sign, protects it from change. There is no reason to prefer a different word, because none of them have a true association. Language therefore acts, according to Saussure, as a conservative force. This is an interesting concept. It means that there's no reason why you can improve a language, if that makes sense, because it's all arbitrary anyway. So why would you change anything? It's not like you can change something to be more accurate. It's not like you can provide a more accurate word for the tree concept, because it's all going to be arbitrary anyway. So there's no reason to change anything. So according to Saussure, language is inherently conservative for this reason. It doesn't want to change. So that's arbitrariness. Now I want to think about the relational. This is a concept that Saussure goes to great lengths to provide examples for in the course on general linguistics, and it's something that I will also provide a few examples for, just to make sure that we understand the concept, because it's an important one. It's at the centre of the idea of difference, which is not just a powerful structuralist concept, but a post-structuralist one too. The idea that your definition, the definition of a thing, does not come from the thing itself. This is crucial. A thing does not define itself. A thing is not defined by itself. A thing is defined by what it is not, by what it is different from, by its position in a chain of different meanings, in a chain of different concepts. So no word can be defined in isolation from other words. As I said, the definition of a word depends only on its relation to adjacent words. This is difference. So the example Peter Barry in Beginning Theory uses is the word hut. He says the word hut has meaning only in relation to other related words. Hovel, for example, shed. There's hut in the middle, house, mansion, and palace. If any of one of these words is removed, then the words adjacent to it are affected as well, aren't they? Because their meaning is only relational to the words surrounding them. So, because they each have subtly different shades of meaning. So the word mansion, for example, there it is, the second from top one in that list. The word mansion is defined by being larger and more impressive than a house, of course, but less grand than a palace, which is the one above it in the chain. So if either of these words were altered, the word mansion too would be altered, because it wouldn't be defined by what was next to it, by its position in this chain, by its difference. So that's what I mean by relational. That's what Saussure means by relational. He also points specifically towards what he calls dyads. These are important, and he draws attention to them. Paired opposites. So think of this chain logic, but in the sense that two opposite words that define themselves by being opposite. So male-female is one that's used a lot to kind of critique things in structuralist, post-structuralist dialogue. Night and day would be a good example. There's not necessarily a chain there. These two things are opposite to each other, ideally, and therefore they define each other by their opposition, by their pure difference. Here's another example of how this relational chain of difference works. You can see here the individual signs consisting of the two aspects, the signified and the signifier, all linked together in the chain. The sign is ultimately determined by the other signs in the system, which delimit its meaning and possible range of use, rather than its internal sound pattern and concept. So in the structuralist worldview, the thing itself, its internal aspects, don't really matter. All that matters is its position in the system, its position in the structure, as in structuralism. Here's an example of this phenomenon that Saussure himself gives in the course in general linguistics, the famous example of the train. I'll read this out. Saussure gives the example of two 8:45 p.m. express trains from Geneva to Paris, leaving at 24-hour intervals. For us, they are the same express we are talking about, the same entity when we refer to it, even though its carriages, locomotive and personnel are probably quite different on the two occasions. But it is not such material identities we refer to when we refer to the 8:45 Geneva-Paris Express. Rather, it is the relational identity given in the timetable. This is the 8:45 Geneva-Paris Express because it is not the 7:45 Geneva-Heidelberg Express, the 8:45 Geneva-Turin, etc. The only thing that gives the train its identity is its position in a structure of differences. It is because it is not the train either side of itself. Its position, therefore its identity, is purely relational. Here's another example I've found. This is from a lecture given by Paul H. Fry, the eminent Yale literary critic. It's a video lecture. It's worth a watch if you want to go a bit further with this material. I've included the link down here, so feel free to look up the PowerPoint slides on Moodle and follow the link. So he's using a similar example here of a ship. I'll read this out. Take the word ship. A ship is very closely related in sound to certain other words. That is one associational matrix or network that one can think of in the arrangement of that sign in language. But there are also synonyms for ship. Bark, boat, bateau, sailboat, and a great many other synonyms. They too exist in a cluster. Steamship, ocean liner. In other words, words that don't sound at all the same but are contiguous in synonymity. They cluster in that way. And then furthermore, ship is also the opposite of certain things, so that it would also enter into a relationship with train, car, truck, mule, modes of transportation. In all of these ways, ship is clustered associationally in language in ways that make it available to be chosen as appropriate for a certain semantic context that we try to develop when we speak. Okay, we've got a long quote now, and this really is a summary quote that I've selected. This is from... I've lost the slide there. No matter. This is from Terry Eagleton's Literary Criticism. It's a nice summary of structuralism as we've kind of seen it thus far, of the different aspects that came out of Ferdinand de Saussure and were adopted by others later. So I'll read this out. Literary structuralism flourished in the 1960s as an attempt to apply to literature the methods and insights of the founder of modern structural linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure viewed language as a system of signs, which was to be studied synchronically, that is to say, studied as a complete system at a given point in time, rather than diachronically, in its historical development. Each sign was to be seen as being made up of a signifier, a sound image, or its graphic equivalent, and a signified, the concept or meaning. The three black marks CAT are a signifier, which evoke the signified cat in an English mind. The relation between signifier and signified is an arbitrary one. There is no inherent reason why these three marks should mean cat other than cultural and historical convention. Contrast chat in French. The relation between the whole sign and what it refers to, what Saussure calls the referent, the real furry four-legged creature, is therefore also arbitrary. Each sign in the system has meaning only by virtue of its difference from the others. Cat has meaning not in itself, but because it is not cap, or cad, or bat. It does not matter how the signifier alters, as long as it preserves its difference from all the other signifiers. You can pronounce it in many different accents, as long as this difference is maintained. In the linguistic system, says Saussure, there are only differences. Meaning is not mysteriously immanent in a sign, but is functional, the result of its difference from other signs. Finally, Saussure believed that linguistics would get into a hopeless mess if it concerned itself with actual speech, or parole, as he called it. More on that in a second. He was not interested in investigating what people actually said. He was concerned with the objective structure of signs, which made their speech possible in the first place, and this he called langue. Neither was Saussure concerned with the real objects which people spoke about. In order to study language effectively, the reference of the signs, the things they actually denoted, had to be placed in brackets. So a lot of interesting stuff there, a lot of interesting summaries of the points we've been discussing. A useful quote and one to return to, certainly if you want to revisit structuralism. Here's a section I've taken out of the book itself, Ferdinand de Saussure, Course in General Linguistics. He's talking about these familiar concepts, arbitrariness, signifier, signifieds. You can come back and revisit this. It's just to show what these ideas look like in their original language. So do come back, look up the lecture slides, and look at this extract if you want to go into more detail on structuralism. Here he is again, talking about another principle. This is the linear character of the signal. Linear means straight line. He's talking here about how a sign, a signifier and a signified have a linear relationship, how they have a direct relationship rather than a multifarious one. So these are two words that we just encountered in that Terry Eagleton extract, langue and parole. And these are quite important concepts for Saussure's view of language. This is how he breaks up language itself. So earlier we looked at the difference between the signifier and the signified. That's how a sign is broken up, an individual sign, like tree. Saussure also breaks up the entirety of language into two separate components in a similar sort of way. This is what langue and parole are, the two fundamental dimensions, the two fundamental divisions of language. So langue refers to language itself, the entire system, the whole language and everything in it. Parole refers to the individual utterances made by individual speakers, so individual words, concepts expressed in an individual moment. Here's Terence Hawkes describing very nicely how these two things are differentiated. Saussure's own analogy is a distinction between the abstract set of rules and conventions called chess and the actual concrete games played by people in the real world. The rules of chess can be said to exist above and beyond each individual game, and yet they only ever acquire concrete form in the relationships that develop between the pieces in individual games. So with language. The nature of the langue lies beyond, and yet determines the nature of each manifestation of parole. Yet it has no concrete existence of its own, except in the piecemeal manifestations that speech affords. So a useful analogy there. We can look at it in a different way. As an iceberg, nice, straightforward kind of visual aid. Parole, that's the individual speech act or what have you, is a small part of the iceberg that appears above the water. Here we are. Langue is the larger mass that supports it, is implied by it, but never itself appears. This is the entirety of the language, all its presumptions, all its presuppositions, all of its ideology, everything else, that lurks underneath every single individual active statement, active expression. So that's langue and parole. Important concepts, but actually quite straightforward ones. Actually quite simple words to integrate into your structuralist vocabulary. The words we'll encounter as we look at other thinkers. So that's kind of the linguistic origin of structuralism. Those are the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure. But that really, with structuralism, is only our starting point. This is where we begin, but this is not where we end. In the course on general linguistics, Saussure himself predicts in many ways what's going to happen. He talks about a science that studies the life of signs within society being conceivable. I shall call it semiology, from Greek semion, sign. Linguistics is only a part of the general science of semiology. By studying rites, customs, etc. as signs, I believe that we shall throw new light on the facts and point up the need for including them in a science of semiology. So very prophetic, as we'll see. Here's Terry Eagleton, kind of pointing towards something similar. What structuralism became, I suppose. Structuralism in general is an attempt to apply this linguistic theory, that being de Saussure's linguistic theory, to objects and activities other than language itself. This is what started to happen in the 1950s and 60s, as we'll see. You can view a myth, a wrestling match, a system of tribal kinship, a restaurant menu, or an oil painting, anything else indeed, as a system of signs, and a structuralist analysis will try to isolate the underlying set of laws by which these signs are combined into meanings. It will largely ignore what the signs actually say and concentrate instead on their internal relations to one another. So that's the fundamental structuralist gesture there. We're not limiting ourselves to linguistics anymore, but we're still looking at signs, not just word signs, every sign, oil paintings, menus, wrestling matches, myths, as having only really relevance and importance in the overarching structure which they belong to, just like the relational signs. Remember hut, house, mansion, palace, all of that. They only have relevance in as much as they have a relation to other elements, not on their own, not internally. Here's Peter Barry, our friend Peter Barry, Beginning Theory, giving a nice summary on a similar emphasis. For the structuralist, the culture we are part of can be read like a language. Okay, this is the after effect of the field of linguistics reaching out, influencing us. The culture we are part of can be read like a language. Using these principles, the principles of structuralism, since culture is made up of many structural networks which carry significance and can be shown to operate in a systematic way. These networks operate through codes as a system of signs. They can make statements, just as language does, and they can be read or decoded by the structuralist or semiotician. So linguistics has colonized reality, has colonized every other discipline. Now we see the world and everything in it like a language. This is the logic of the structuralist. So here is the most notable transition point between structuralism as pure linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure, and what came later, structuralism as everything in society. This is Claude Levi-Strauss, 1908 to 2009, quite long-lived, as you can see, who was an anthropologist. This meant he would study culture. He would study like tribal cultures and this kind of thing, and try and make general assessments on human nature based on the observation of people living in societies. So his innovation is to apply the structuralist method, that linguistic method, to myths. Individual tales, so individual stories within the myth, are parole, you remember this term, which have an overarching place in the whole of a culture's cycle of myths, which is the langue. So now we have a culture being treated like a language. The entire culture of the people is the langue, is the language, and individual myths, individual tales being told within that culture are the parole, are like the individual speech act. Levi-Strauss, in his structural view of things, essentially viewed different myths and different cultures as essentially variations on a number of basic themes. By comparing different myths, by comparing different aspects of society, you can get commonalities across culture, showing that people tend to repeat certain key patterns. This is what later would become called comparative anthropology. He used the rules of grammar to define this kind of anthropological world. The mytheme is derived from a morpheme, which is, you don't need to know all of the details, but it's a kind of a complex grammatical term which he is adapting here. Barry's talking about the typical structuralist process of moving from the particular to the general. This is what we see with that approach towards myths. Levi-Strauss demonstrated that Saussure's ideas, his linguistic ideas, could be taken from that field and applied to a variety of other fields. This was the first instance of it being done successfully and notoriously, and it was very influential. Many critics, Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, write about Levi-Strauss. His influence is not just limited to the anthropological, the same way that de Saussure's is not limited to the linguistic. He's a vital pipeline. And we begin to see, this is the first time we start to see that key notion which would come to dominate the structuralist world, this idea that the world itself could be interpreted as being simply one big signifying system. Within his own purview, within anthropology, Levi-Strauss demonstrated, or tried to demonstrate, that each system, whether it's kinship, food, political ideology, marriage rituals, cooking, etc., etc., constitute a partial expression of a total culture, conceived ultimately as a gigantic language. So we have langue, we have parole. He demonstrated, we talked about a moment ago about these commonalities between different cultures that the structuralist tends to favour. We can see this as a sort of vertical reading. I've got a graph of this, I'll show you in a second. So rather than reading a story horizontally, so we begin at the beginning of the story, and then we read the middle of the story, then we read the end, which is traditionally how we would do something like literary criticism, isn't it? We read vertically instead. Let me show you. So here we have a story, linearly, going across the top there. So the left to right is individual stories. They're lined up on top of each other. And the structuralist doesn't read this linearly. Sorry, he doesn't read this horizontally. He reads it vertically. So he reads different aspects of the same story, making comparisons between them. So we have a vertical reading here. These different aspects where people are killed. We're not reading the story, one story. We're reading all the stories simultaneously along their common elements in this vertical sense. So another big influence, another big pipeline coming out of Levi-Strauss is narratology. This is a concept you might have encountered before. It's one more relevant to our immediate field of study, which of course is the study of literature. But narratology refers to the Levi-Strauss-esque characterization of story plots, so plots within narrative, hence narratology. It consists in generalizing the model beyond the unwritten texts of tribal mythology, as in Strauss, to other kinds of story, fairy tales, the Bible, novels, etc., etc. So Vladimir Prop is the big name here. He's what's known as a Russian formalist. He wrote a book called Morphology of the Folk Tale in 1928, which reduces all folk tales to 7 spheres of action and 31 fixed elements or functions. So everything is reduced down to its structure. All that matters is the interrelation between its different structural elements. The idea of the individual tale itself, the individual story, the individual characters within each story isn't really important, is it? All that matters is the overarching structure and the overarching relationship between all these different elements. This is structuralism for the first time starting to affect literature, starting to affect the way we read narratives. in a way that would be infamous and useful in simultaneously. So I've got a couple of quotes from critics here, talking about what I've called the advantages. What are the advantages of structuralism? What's its advantage for the study of literature, for the study of society? Is it a useful tool? Is it a powerful tool? It was certainly an influential and famous one, but what are its advantages? Let's see. So here's Terry Eagleton. What are the gains of structuralism? To begin with, it represents a remorseless demystification of literature. Loosely subjective talk was chastised by a criticism which recognised that the literary work, like any other product of language, is a construct whose mechanisms could be classified and analysed like the objects of any other science. The romantic prejudice that the poem, like a person, harboured a vital essence, a soul which it was discourteous to tamper with, was rudely unmasked as a bit of disguised theology, a superstitious fear of reasoned inquiry which made a fetish of literature and reinforced the authority of a naturally sensitive critical elite. Moreover, the structuralist method implicitly questioned literature's claim to be a unique form of discourse. Since deep structures could be dug out of Mickey Spillane, as well as Sir Philip Sidney, and no doubt the same ones at that, it was no longer easy to assign literature an ontologically privileged status. So it's banishing the romantic, this special view, not just of the text itself, but the special discerning critical capabilities of the institutional academic or the critic, who prides himself on their kind of sensitivity towards literature and their ability to decipher it. It's taking it into a more scientific form, a more perhaps utilitarian form. This could be a strength, perhaps, or perhaps we lose more than we would otherwise be comfortable with in the process. The disadvantage, of course, is that, you might well have noticed this by now or guessed at it, structuralism is fundamentally anti-humanist and in many ways anti-human. It has no way of dealing with the individual subject. It more or less abolishes the human subject altogether. We have no real way of gauging individuality. We have no way of looking at the individual, indeed. All we can see is structures. All we can see is the overarching interrelationship between different objects within a system, including people, which is fundamentally and quite profoundly unhuman, inhumane. This is a problem for which structuralism doesn't really have an answer. Here's Eagleton again. Structuralism is, among other things, one more of literary theory's series of doomed attempts to replace religion with something as effective. We saw this, we mentioned this when we were talking about liberal humanists in week 2. In this case, with the modern religion of science. But the search for a purely objective reading of literary works clearly poses grievous problems. It seems impossible to eradicate some element of interpretation, and so of subjectivity, from even the most rigorously objective analysis. How, for example, did the structuralist identify the various signifying units of the text in the first place? How did he or she decide that a specific set of signs, sign or set of signs, constituted such a basic unit, without recourse to frames of cultural assumption, which structuralism in its strictest forms wished to ignore? So you're trusting what Eagleton's saying here is that you're trusting the scientific capabilities of the structuralist critic. But why should you? This isn't like mathematics, where you have an objective truth, is it? It's always going to be somebody's decision, somebody's bias, perhaps. Is there an answer to this question? So we move now into Roland Barthes. So this is the apex of structuralism applying itself to society. We've looked at the linguistic origin of structuralism. We've looked at its adaptation into anthropology through Claude Levi-Strauss. And we've thought about its being applied to folk tales, narratology by Vladimir Propp. Roland Barthes was a literary critic, so we have for the first time perhaps structuralism arriving at what we might call theory, in the sense of critical theory, like this course we're doing at the moment. Roland Barthes is the key pipeline in between that. So he was a structuralist. As we'll see in a future lecture, he was potentially also a post-structuralist. He potentially moved from one to the other over the course of his career with his work on the death of the author. In Mythologies, 1957, which is itself from the structuralist phase of his career, Barthes seeks to prove that nothing is innocent of ideology. Mythologies itself is a remorseless analysis of the myths generated by French mass media, demonstrating these covert manipulations of codes by the media for their own purposes. Nothing is innocent. Washing powder, innocent holidays, catalogues, novels. These things seem innocent and neutral objects, but through a structuralist analysis, Barthes shows that they are in fact loaded with covert attempts at manipulation, with expectation, with a variety of different significations that would escape a superficial reading. This is presumably what you might imagine the advantage of structuralism. It brings out concepts that to a surface level reading we wouldn't be able to see, we wouldn't be able to perceive. Layers of significance are revealed by the action of examining a structure in the context of its overall position in the larger system. Okay, so this is the key structuralist gesture. So boxing, this is the first chapter, is associated with repression and endurance, whereas wrestling is associated with flamboyant displays. They serve different social functions to do with catharsis, depending on the sort of individual social need. The marketing of soap powders and skin creams. These are expressed in the vocabulary of international conflict, of war, and staged in epic terms, presumably to summon up these kind of archetypal images in our brain. Perhaps the most interesting, useful, powerful aspect of the book is something called the Dominici affair. I've got a little summary here. This is an event that took place in 1952. Gaston Dominici, the 80-year-old owner of a farm in Provence, was convicted of murdering Sir Jack Drummond, an English aristocrat and statesman, and his wife and daughter, whom he'd found camping near his land. So, very controversial affair in its time, very, very difficult, very problematic, and Barthes takes it on head on. In this chapter of the name above, Dominici or the Triumph of Literature, Mythologies, Barthes claims that an old French peasant was condemned to death by a form of citationality that had come to look like truth. The material evidence in the case was not clear-cut, and Dominici's trial for murder depended on psychological probability. However, the psychological truths that were self-evident, inverted commas, in the courtroom were in fact the character types of a 19th century novel. They were self-evident, that is, to everyone except the accused, who did not share the classical, literate and literary French of his accusers. So this is what he means by the triumph of literature in the name of the title. Literature has triumphed because it is determining reality. It's more real than reality. Here we are, here's the accused, sat in the trial. There's the gendarmes. Here's Barthes from Mythology. This is the murdered people on the right there. Fascinating story. I'm surprised nobody's made a Netflix true crime special about this story. Perhaps it's in the pipeline. So here's a quote from Mythologies. The whole Dominici trial was enacted according to a certain idea of psychology, which happens to be, as luck would have it, that of the literature of the bourgeois establishment. Since material evidence was uncertain or contradictory, one had to resort to evidence of a mental kind. And where could one find it except in the very mentality of the accusers? Do these mentalities, that of the old peasant from the Alps and that of the judiciary, function in the same way? Nothing is less likely. And yet it is in the name of a universal psychology that old Dominici has been condemned, descending from the charming empyrean of bourgeois novels and essentialist psychology. Literature, the triumph of literature, remember, has just condemned a man to the guillotine. What a triumph. Now that particular psychology, in the name of which you can very well today have your head cut off, comes straight from our traditional literature, that which one calls, in bourgeois style, literature of the human document. It is in the name of the human document that the old Dominici has been condemned. Justice and literature have made an alliance, they've exchanged their old techniques, thus revealing their basic identity, and compromising each other barefacedly. Antithesis, metaphors, flight of oratory. It is the whole of classical rhetoric which accuses the old shepherd here. Justice took the mask of realist literature, of the country tale. So very strident declarations here, very powerful, very impassioned. But it's important to point out that it's only through the structuralist perspective, that Barthes is seeing the truth here, if you like, or at least that's how he interprets it. To everybody else, reality is the reality of literature, but only by breaking things down into the structural component, by reading things vertically, can you see patterns emerging. That the injustice was only carried out here because it corresponded to a pattern that only structuralism can point out. So in a sense we have here the triumph of structuralism itself, righting wrongs, solving injustice, swooping in heroically and saving poor old condemned elderly farmers, or at least that's how Barthes sees it. He was eventually released, Dominici, but he never quite got the not guilty vindication. They just sort of waved him off and tried to brush the whole embarrassing escapade underneath the carpet. Nobody's ever been properly accused since then of having murdered Sir Jack Drummond and his family. So I'm just going to look at a couple more examples, a couple more quotes from Roland Barthes' mythologies, just to give you a sense of what he's up to, what his structuralist view of the world can accomplish, how you can read codes into things and get a sort of revelation out of it, a sort of new perspective. Here he is talking about margarine. What does it matter after all, if margarine is just fat, when it goes further than butter and costs less? What does it matter after all, if order is a little brutal or a little blind when it allows us to live cheaply? Here we are in our turn, rid of a prejudice which cost us dearly, too dearly, which cost us too much in scruples, in revolt, in fights and in solitude. So he's comparing margarine here to the oppressive ways of the bourgeois, to the fact that we all kind of tacitly accept small compromises and sacrifices in human rights, the same way we might accept fat levels in margarine. Here he is talking about toys. Now this is quite interesting. He shows how being given specific toys as a child can predispose you towards certain outcomes, which I think is certainly true. French toys. One could not find a better illustration of the fact that the adult Frenchman sees the child as another self. All the toys one commonly sees are essentially a microcosm of the adult world. They are all reduced copies of human objects, as if in the eyes of the public the child was, all told, nothing but a smaller man, a homunculus to whom must be supplied objects of his own size. Invented forms are very rare. A few sets of blocks, which appeal to the spirit of do-it-yourself, are the only ones which offer dynamic forms. As for the others, French toys always mean something, and this something is always entirely socialised, constituted by the myths or the techniques of modern adult life. The army, broadcasting, the post office, medicine, miniature instrument cases, operating theatres with dolls, school, hairstyling, dryers for permanent waving, the air force, parachutists, transports, trains, citrons, vedettes, vespers, petrol stations, science, Martian toys, I guess those were popular in the 50s. The fact that French toys literally prefigure the world of adult functions obviously cannot but prepare the child to accept them all, by constituting for him, even before he can think about it, the alibi of a nature which has at all times created soldiers, postmen and vespers. Toys here reveal the list of all the things the adult does not find unusual: war, bureaucracy, ugliness, Martians, etc. So even with the best of intentions, we are imposing these categories, these kind of propaganda efforts on children. This is something which Barthes' structuralist critique is revealing to us. He's revealing to us the patterns that we might not otherwise see, that aren't directly in front of our eyes. And here he is making a parallel between time in a very comparative sense. This almost harkened back to Levi Strauss and his comparative anthropology, talking about the new Citroën, the new car. I think that cars today are almost the exact equivalent of the great Gothic cathedrals. I mean the supreme creation of an era, conceived with passion by unknown artists, and consumed in image, if not in usage, by a whole population which appropriates them as a purely magical object. So, to the structuralist, the whole world is riven with mythology. Remember, that's the name of the book, mythology. The world is itself mythologized. It's full of myths and legends, but they are being channeled through new iterations, through the car, through toys, through, there's a chapter on the jet man in mythologies where they're compared to kind of gods who stand between earth and heaven. The world is full of mythology. Barthes is essentially Levi Straussifying the modern world, saying we're all in a system of myth. We're all like the tribal people who Levi Strauss studies. We just delude ourselves into thinking we're somehow, inverted commas, modern, and therefore different. But we're not. Using his structuralist approach, he makes direct links between the more mythic world of the people Levi Strauss studied and the world of modernity, which thinks it's distant. The structuralist critique reveals the commonalities between all of these things, the same way it would reveal the commonalities between different myths, between different works of literature and narratology, and such things. So we're moving towards the end of the lecture now. I've just got a couple of concluding points. Barthes explains how myth converts history into nature. This is the process that's important. This is the sort of function it serves that he's looking to expose. And the task of the mythographer, so that's Barthes himself writing mythologies, is to rediscover the element of history that motivates the myth, to look for the kernel of truth, to elicit what is specific to a given time and place, asking what interests are served by the naturalization of particular convictions and values. So why do we take certain things for granted? Why do we take them as natural when, in fact, they very much are not? That's what the mythographer, that's what the structuralist uses his critique to try and attempt to do. That is what the book Mythologies is an attempt to do. So, we've reached the end of the lecture. I've just got a couple of interesting concluding points here. Here's a quote from Terence Hawkes. We live in a world which has no pure, no innocent context to offer us, a world of signs about rather than experience of. It follows that structuralism's final inclination must be towards a science appropriate to the analysis of such a world. So a nice pithy sentiment there, which brings together two of the key concepts, this idea of innocence in the Barthian sense, that the whole world is full of rhetoric, it's full of codes, it's full of advertisers trying to trick us, but also the idea of a world of signs being relational rather than individual. These two things, these two aspects being brought together, offer the apex of the structuralist method. As an extension of that, the innocence of literature itself is an illusion. There is no innocence. There are codes, there are myths, they serve a function. And finally, and this becomes important as we move towards post-structuralism in a future lecture, the critic is participant in the work he reads. He creates the finished work by his reading of it. In structuralism, we begin to see the first instances of this, and indeed it is the arch-structuralist Roland Barthes who writes about the death of the author, and thereby, in many ways, integrates the post-structuralist era. But more on that, as I said, in a future lecture. We will leave this here for now. Thank you all for your attention, and I will see you, hopefully, in person very soon. Thanks again.